Take mine off, because otherwise I'm talking all the time. So this class is a kind of hybrid class. I'm going to be speaking in English around about this speed. If I'm talking too fast or too slow, then you tell me. Yeah, this is for you and not for me. So if anything is obscure, you don't understand, okay, please put your hand up, ask a question. Okay, there are no stupid questions. Right? You also have my email address. I think if you have a question, yeah, I sent an email last week because I wasn't here. I had no voice. Did you receive that email? Yes. So you have my email address. Okay. If you have a question or a problem, you send me an email and I will answer your email. All right. Yeah. So this class is a kind of hybrid class it's of American history. But it's a history which I hope gives a background for the institutions of government, right? So it's not just a class about institutions. It's not a history class in the sense of a comprehensive history of the United States. It's a kind of hybrid of the two, okay? It's in kind of 4 parts. The first part is like 3 or 4 weeks, where I talk about the historical development, yeah, from the beginning. Certain aspects of it, particularly kind of economic aspects of it. I mean, to think, for example, like George Washington, yeah? You need a plaquette there, like, yeah, well. George Washington, the first president, the General Washington, was the richest man in America. So you think, well, yeah, is that important? What does that tell us? There's something called the American Revolution, right? And the American Revolution was generally supported by, donc 1776, oui, independence jusqu'en 83. It was generally supported by conservative British intellectuals, whereas the French Revolution was opposed by conservative British intellectuals generally. Il y avait beaucoup de Britanniques, d'Anglais à Paris dans la Révolution, oui. Même dans la Convention, il y avait des Anglais. So why the difference? Right, so one of the reasons for the difference is that British intellectuals considered the American Revolution to be natural and the French Revolution to be unnatural. Because there's such a discours at the time around the law of nature, natural law. Right? Natural law is a kind of technical phrase with a particular history, okay? Can I just say one thing I tell to all my classes? If you're in here, that's great. If you don't want to be in here, that's great too. What I don't want is for people to be chatting, papoting in here, because it feels like having a moustique in your bedroom. It's really irritating. So I have no problem with people going out and enjoying the sun, but if you're in here, you don't papoter, all right? Yeah? So, natural law is a phrase with a particular kind of history in European culture. It's a phrase, it's a notion, an idea that was developed in the 16th century by a guy called Grotius. Vous connaissez ce nom, Grotius? Non? G-R-O-T-I-U-S. Grotius. In Holland. Because what Grotius meant by natural law was the law of human reason, okay, as opposed to God's law, right? So Grotius is in the same kind of lineage of humanism with Erasmus, for example, yeah? Is anybody here an Erasmus student? No, I don't have any Erasmus here? No, okay. In Indian law, the idea of natural en Inde, aux Indes, Mumbai, Delhi, natural law has a very different meaning. It's to do with the harmony between human law and the natural world, the cosmos. Okay? In Chinese law, natural law is also different, has a different understanding. Yeah? In certain African legal systems too, natural law has a different meaning. I use that term in the European sense, donc in the American sense. Okay. So the guys working for the revolution in the 18th century in America, they used certain ideas, right, like natural law, like self-evidence, l'évidence, it's obvious. Yeah. It's a middle-class revolution, like most of the French Revolution. And the middle class creates its own values in the 17th century. Yeah. I will be talking about English Revolution, parce qu'en Angleterre, il y a eu deux révolutions au XVIIe siècle. Oui, deux révolutions qui ont formé les institutions américaines, beaucoup. Parce que, évidemment, c'est des Anglais en Amérique. Okay? C'est pas les seuls, c'est pas les Américains. Yeah? Les Américains, ça veut dire les Comanches, les Apaches, les Arawak. The indigenous people, right, qui étaient exterminés. So all these people coming are English, first of all, right? So you need to think about what's going on in British politics at the time to understand the institutions in America. Okay? So you have middle-class revolutions in the 17th century. Je vais parler de ça plus à l'avenir, okay? Dans les semaines à venir. And they're based on certain values. La classe moyenne prend le pouvoir aux dépenses de qui? Qui est remplacé par la classe moyenne, la bourgeoisie? Non? No, the aristocracy. That's exactly right, the aristocracy. So aristocratic power is inherited, hérité. Okay? The middle class doesn't inherit its money. The middle class makes its money. Right? So they invent certain values like, for example, sincerity. Sincerity is a middle class value in the 17th and 18th century. Because sincerity, c'est le trésor de ton cœur. Une vérité des personnes. Yeah? Et si on regarde l'histoire du roman en anglais, le roman, l'histoire du roman anglais du 17e, 18e siècle, même dans le 19e, like Jane Eyre, oui, de Charlotte Brontë, c'est l'histoire d'une jeune bourgeoise, oui, de la classe moyenne, qui n'a pas de fortune, mais qui n'a que la sincérité de son cœur. Et elle subit les prédations des aristocrates. Oui? Et elle réussit à convertir un aristocrate à ses valeurs à elle. Et ça finit par le mariage. Okay? Le mariage, ça crée la famille qui est la citadelle de la bourgeoisie. Yeah. La famille, c'est la citadelle de la culture bourgeoise. Okay? And it's used as a political instrument in the 17th, 18th century. So, et ça, c'est ce qu'on appelle cultural power. The novel is a bourgeois cultural vehicle for establishing its power. Okay? Donc la bourgeoisie prend le pouvoir dans les révolutions en Angleterre et assoit ce pouvoir en créant une culture mais qui confirme, qui valide cette prise de pouvoir, et ça c'est le roman. Okay? Le roman de sensibilité, qui est 90% des histoires des romans, c'est une jeune bourgeoise menacée par un aristocrate qui veut la violer, etc., etc., ou la menace, et qui, elle finit par le convertir à ses valeurs à elle. Okay. So these values like common sense, natural law, sincerity have a political power at this time. Okay, and they appear to be ideals. They're idealized. Okay. And one of the things about the Constitution, right? The Constitution is the central document of this class. So I've been teaching all day, so I'm getting a bit but in this document, you have the whole Constitution in here. Okay, this is your first plaquette. You get another one in November. Okay, so this one is not this one. This one. This one. The first is a colonial America. So yeah, colonial America is the period until 1776. Okay. Colonial America, ça veut dire jusqu'en 1776. And it's an introduction to the Constitution, and then the first branch of the Constitution, of the government rather, is the legislative branch. Okay? And then in November you get another plaquette dealing with the other two branches of the Constitution, of the government, the executive and the judiciary. Right? So in here you have the whole of the American Constitution in this plaquette. Right? The Constitution is a very elastic document. All right? Most of the Constitution is the amendments to the Constitution. The Constitution has three parts. The first part is a kind of préambule, which is a preamble, which is a kind of intention of the Constitution. The second part is the articles of the Constitution. There are 7 articles of the Constitution. And the third part is the amendments. There are 27 amendments to the Constitution. Okay, here it's an older document, there's only 26. The 27th one is from the 1970s, it's on the concern about, okay? But there are 27 amendments. It's very elastic, okay? And that's why it has such longevity, right? The American Constitution has been very influential. But one thing that kind of determines the way I teach this class is that on the one hand the Constitution is a kind of philosophical document with sort of, you know, questions of moral, political, philosophical principle, okay, to do with things like justice, for example, you know, representation, etc. Yeah, things which seem to be the basis of democracy, or what you call in French an état de droit, right? These principles and principes. On the other hand, the Constitution is a historical document. Yeah, it was developed at a particular moment in history, and it shows the pressures of historical events. And I'll look at that in a moment dans the text. Okay. For example. In 1890, donc ce que je fais aujourd'hui, c'est, il y a une partie un peu anecdotique de ce que je raconte aujourd'hui, c'est juste des petits jalons que je pose comme ça pour éclairer un terrain. Oui, c'est ça l'idée. Oui. And to point out some contradictions, des contradictions et des tensions dans ce système. Okay. There's another problem too, which is the problem of language. The problem that you guys living in France, French political terms and structures, they don't really translate into America, and vice versa. Okay. So, for example, ideas of left and right, yeah, they don't really translate into American droite-gauche. Like the French word libéral is not the English word liberal. It doesn't mean the same. English liberal is more like libertaire in France. Okay? So in English, a liberal, en termes français, c'est beaucoup plus à gauche. Un libéral en français, c'est pour la privatisation, yeah? Free market. Yeah? Sarkozy is a liberal. Sarkozy is absolutely not a liberal. Okay? Le gaullisme en France, yeah? Le gaullisme, Chirac, you're too young to remember Chirac. The gaullisme was very strongly in favor of service public. Okay? Il y avait des conflits entre Giscard, qui était un libéral, et Chirac, who was a conservative. Chirac, gaullisme, very much in favor of public service. Yeah? Public institutions. Socially, very conservative. Right? So socially, on social conservatism between Giscard and Chirac, a lot of shared values, okay, but not in terms of public service. In The Anglosphere, which is a word you may not know, the Anglosphere, that means like Anglo-American culture, yeah, okay, which goes, of course, to Australia, India, less de moins en moins, maintenant. New Zealand, Canada, okay, it's the Anglosphere, okay. The language is very different. I mean, in English, in French, you have one word, liberté, right? In English, there's two words, freedom and liberty, and they do not mean the same. They're not synonyms. Freedom is not the same as liberty. Freedom is ontologique. You're born free. Yeah? Liberty is something within a social identity, a social existence, within a society. Okay? I mean, I think one of the interesting things about Rousseau, in Rousseau's work, yeah, is justement, il pense beaucoup à ça, that what does liberté mean? Yeah, because he wants a meaning which is like freedom. Okay. I mean, the relationship with France and England very interesting in this kind of period. That I don't know if you read Voltaire, Les Lettres philosophiques of Voltaire. Vous connaissez ce texte? Voltaire. Vous avez lu Candide ou non? Micromégas, Zadig, machin. Okay. Les Lettres philosophiques de Voltaire, c'est 1732, je crois. Et c'est là où il donne donc ses idées sur la philosophie politique. Yeah? And it's all taken from the English guy John Locke. Locke, L-O-C-K-E, dont il sera beaucoup question là. Locke, qui est celui qui a inventé l'idée du contrat social avant Rousseau. Voltaire was therefore, an English kind of liberal. Voltaire aussi était très content quand il avait son argent, ça lui donnait de quoi, vous savez, l'argent de Voltaire, de l'esclavage. Et Voltaire était très content quand on lui a dit qu'ils avaient nommé un navire esclavagiste le Voltaire. Il était tout content. Yeah. So there are lots of contradictions in this period, of course, yeah. But coming back to this idea of the historical elasticity of the Constitution, in 1896, two black guys were on a train in America, right? And they were in a white compartment, okay? And of course there was segregation at the time, right? Okay, segregation. And so they were thrown off the train, all right? And so they got a lawyer. It was the beginning of the civil rights thing, the very beginnings of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP. So the case of these two guys, it's a very famous case, je vais revenir dessus, ne vous inquiétez pas pour le nom, je dis le nom c'est Plessy Ferguson. Ferguson, donc ce nom un peu maudit dans l'histoire des Noirs aux États-Unis, the Ferguson riots. Plessy Ferguson case went up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court then had to decide, is segregation constitutional? Constitutional means conforme à la Constitution. Okay? Because the Constitution is like one of the supreme laws in America. Okay? And the Supreme Court, on est en 1896, Plessy Ferguson, they decide that segregation is constitutional. Okay? They say that the races are separate but equal. It's separate but equal. And of course that becomes the phrase, the kind of devise of the apartheid state in South Africa, right? Instauré en 1948 jusqu'à Mandela. Oui, apartheid comme en Palestine, apartheid en Palestine. C'est le même principe. And in 1896, segregation was considered constitutional. In 1954, so 58 years later, there was a black guy in the town of Topeka, Kansas, state of Kansas, who wanted, he was called Mr. Brown, and he wanted to send his little girl to school, the local school. The local school was for white people, right? White kids. So she couldn't go there. So he took a lawyer, went up to the Supreme Court in another famous case called Brown Topeka. And then the Supreme Court decided that segregation is unconstitutional. Segregation is against the Constitution. So you think, wait a minute, the same Supreme Court, the same segregation, the same Constitution, a different judgment. Yeah. Why is it different? Well, it's different, of course, because historical circumstances have changed. 1954 is not 1896. Okay? So the Constitution then is an elastic document, and it has actually a clause in it called the Elastic Clause. It has certain vagueness. Alors, Guillaume, what do we look at the Elastic Clause? On va revenir là-dessus. The Elastic Clause is on. So, donc, si vous ouvrez votre plaquette à la page 11, donc écrite à la main, c'est la première page de la Constitution. And if you go, donc si vous allez à la page 13, on va beaucoup regarder la Constitution. I want you to read the Constitution. C'est your lecture de chevet. Okay? Every evening, look at the Constitution. Okay? I want you to become familiar with the Constitution. You know, whatever you do, I'm going to give you a little kind of sermon. Whatever you do, whether you're making a business plan, okay, whether you're inventing a racing car, or you're making a daube provençal for a restaurant you've opened, or you're talking about American history, the most important thing is that you should, to get the trust, la confiance de l'autre, is that you should be familiar with your material. You know your stuff, right? You know your birth, right? You know your couture. You know your business plan. You know your market. You don't have a business. You know the market, yeah? You're a doctor. You know the body, etc. Right? So the more familiar you can get with your material, whatever you do, the better it is, okay? In this case, I want you to read and reread this document. I want you to try and understand it. If there's things you don't understand in it, you send me an email. Okay? If there's things that seem obscure in it, you ask me. Okay? I want you to become familiar with this document. Alright? Donc, on est à la page 13, donc écrite à la main. Et là, vous voyez en bas vers la gauche, c'est marqué Section 8. Vous voyez ça? The Congress shall have power. Est-ce que vous voyez ça? C'est là, ici, là, cette page. Okay? So these are the powers of Congress. Okay? And if you go to number 18 of these powers, yeah, Congress shall have power to do this, right? To make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. Donc là, jusque-là, on a eu 17 autres pouvoirs du Congrès. Oui. Donc, par exemple, le pouvoir de déclarer la guerre, c'est le Congrès qui déclare la guerre, pas le président. Le président n'a pas le pouvoir, le droit de déclarer la guerre à qui que ce soit. Okay, that's why George Bush, on 9/11, he declared war on what? You know, after the 11 September, Bush declared war on. It was the war on Iran. Iraq, well, they just invaded Iraq, bombed it. They didn't declare war on Iraq. War on terror. Because terror is not a state, right? Okay? Yeah? Because Bush doesn't have the right or the power to declare war. There was no Vietnam War. Right? America never declared war on Vietnam. Right? They just bombed Vietnam. Okay, but they didn't declare war on it. The President Nixon sent bombers en secret, sans informer le Congrès, okay, to bomb Cambodge. So here, donc je reviens. Donc, pour reprendre la phrase du début de la section 8, the Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. Foregoing, ça veut dire susmentionné, ci-dessus. Okay, foregoing. Okay? The Congress has the power to make any law it thinks is necessary to allow it to exercise its powers. Yeah? So you guys in Congress, you can make any law you want that will allow you to be Congress. Okay? That's called the elastic clause. Okay? And this elasticity in this document, of course, it's open to interpretation. Right? The document can be interpreted openly. It's not fixed. Right? In France, you have code pénal, code civil. C'est comme les tablettes de Moïse. Because those are French laws. Yeah, it's like stone. In America, you don't just have that. So those laws of code pénal, code civil, those are laws which are passed by the French Parliament, right? Yes? I'll give you a term, a word, okay? Je l'appelle donc statute law, ST. Write it down. You can write it in your lexique, en bas de votre lexique, la première page, okay? ST. A-T. U-T-E. S-T-A-T-U-T-E. Statute and then law. Statute law means laws passed by a parliament. Okay? The acts of parliament, the acts of Congress, les lois de l'Assemblée nationale, la loi du 29 juillet 1881, qu'on voit sur les murs, la loi du 31 décembre, those are statute laws. In France, statute law is supreme law. Not in America. Statute law in America is not supreme law. Supreme law in America, I'll talk about this more when I talk about the judiciary. Supreme law in America is the Constitution and the principles of the Constitution. Même au-dessus de la Constitution et les principes de la Constitution. And we will look later, we'll be looking at some documents from a prisoner at Guantanamo. You know Guantanamo? Est-ce que ce nom vous dit quelque chose, Guantanamo? Oui, c'est la prison américaine où ils ont raflé toutes sortes de gens qui n'avaient rien à voir avec le 11 septembre, mais strictement rien à voir. Ils ont mis là juste parce que c'était des barbus qui se trouvaient au mauvais endroit, au mauvais moment. Pour les 80% de ces gens-là, qui n'avaient absolument rien à voir avec le 11 septembre. Okay? And they're still there, some of them. Yeah, it's in Cuba, right? So I'm going to be looking at some papers from a case of a Guantanamo prisoner, yeah, so that you can see something like how American law works. I'll be looking at that when we look in the last part of the course when we talk about the judiciary. Okay, all right? Yeah, so the document is very elastic. It's got fantastic principles in it. But you can see that the principles are developed in a historical context. Si vous allez à la page 17, s'il vous plaît. Page 17. That's so écrit à la main, la page 17. Okay? There you have the beginning of the amendments. Okay? So they made their constitution, the articles of the Constitution. They made them in a constitutional congress, okay, and immediately they thought, well, there's something wrong with this constitution, and we have to amend the constitution. So the first 10 amendments were written at the same time, okay. So if you look on donc la page 17 là, ça commence là, Article 1, okay. Et donc Article 1, ça c'est le premier amendement, okay. And if you go down and just go over the page, you see Article 10, which is là, donc c'est la page 18, tout à fait en haut à gauche, page 18, oui. Article 10, sous le titre Article 10, etc., il n'y a pas de date. Non? Le Article 11, il y a des dates. À partir de 11, il y a des dates en dessous. Oui? You see that? Yeah? Okay? Because every amendment is written in response to a specific historical situation. Okay? In a moment, I want to look at 3 of these amendments, okay? Which can be a little bit surprising. Can I ask you a general question? Do you think slavery, esclavage, is slavery forbidden, interdit in the United States Constitution? What do you think? Is slavery, was slavery abolished in the United States? Ça, c'est une question plus simple. Yes or no? What do you think? Normalement, yes. But no, actually. Yeah, slavery wasn't abolished in the United States. And it's actually written in the Constitution. First of all, slavery was not forbidden in the Constitution. Yeah. Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration, Jefferson wanted to have a paragraph in the original Constitution to forbid slavery. So Jefferson was a guy from the South. He had slaves. His woman, they shared his bed, was a slave. Like his wife was a black woman, yeah, slave. But she was like Mrs. Jefferson. Yeah. He had slaves on it, and he wanted to abolish slavery. Lots of contradictions. Okay. Slavery is not abolished in the Constitution. And we'll see in a moment why that is. Okay. So the first 10 articles are undated, the first 10 amendments. They have a collective name. It's called the Bill of Rights, which is a term that comes from English politics, the Bill of Rights. Et on va voir ensemble comment la lutte pour les droits du Parlement britannique au XVIIe siècle, donc les droits du Parlement vis-à-vis du roi, ils se métamorphosent pour devenir les droits de l'individu, les droits de l'homme dans la Constitution américaine. Okay? Donc, it's really interesting métamorphose, that. Les droits du Parlement deviennent les droits de l'homme. If you go to the preamble of the Constitution on page 11, the preamble is 5 lines. Okay, on est à page 11, c'est juste là. Donc c'est 5 lignes. Okay, that was for the preamble, préambule. Okay? Et après on a le premier des articles. Il y a 7 articles et 27 amendements. Okay? Là, vous n'en avez que 26. Le 27e is not important. So I read the preamble. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. So the idea is that the union is perfectible. C'est un chantier. Okay? The union is not fixed. It's perfectible. It's plastic. Yeah? In order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility. Now, if you say ensure domestic tranquility, ça veut dire qu'il y a des turbulences à l'intérieur. Il y a des révoltes à l'intérieur. Okay? And one of the things I want to talk about is the relations between poor whites, for example, who are the mass, okay, and blacks and indigenous Native Americans. What were the relations? Were there ever any slave rebellions, for example? Did slaves just kind of accept things, or did they rebel? What about the poor whites? Yeah. The indentured servants, right? Yeah. Which is this 8th time. I didn't just talk about indentured servants, did I? No. So I'll talk about that in a second, yeah. Ensure domestic tranquility. So there was a sort of a need for law and order. Okay. And who needs the law and order most? in this society are the landowners is a ruling class. Okay, they need stability. Provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. So it's elastic, a more perfect union. I don't know if you were following the election of Biden. Did you follow the election of Biden? Yeah? Or rather, the goodbye to Trump. It's not, the American president is not elected by universal suffrage. Vous avez peut-être entendu ce mot electors. Oui? C'est les electors qui choisissent le président, pas le peuple. Okay? Yeah? Vous avez capté un peu ça, ce processus qui semble toujours très bizarre aux non-américains. Yeah? Who are these electors? Yeah? I mean, they're the guys who choose the president. There's just a few hundred of them, right? There's 538 electors. Yeah? Those guys choose the president? How come? Yeah? That's called the Republican form of government. It means indirect suffrage. You don't vote for the president. You vote for an elector. Okay? And the elector is part of a political elite. The elector is chosen by the party because he's a guy they can trust. So it's possible, and obviously je vais revenir là-dessus évidemment quand je parle d'élection. In Vermont, there's, or say in Ohio, like there's 21 electors. Yeah. Those guys say, the Democrat electors say, I promise I'm going to vote for Joe Biden. So you're in Ohio, you vote for these guys, right? Because they say they're going to vote for Joe Biden, and you want Joe Biden. But they have the right, these electors, yeah, to change their mind. They can say, I don't want to vote for Biden, actually. I'm going to vote for Trump. And you can do nothing about it because you voted for them. So the American system has this kind of what they considered, what the establishment considered as a kind of garde-fou contre la masse, of this intermediary of electors, you know, chosen by the parties. These are the guys who choose the president, right? Not the peuple. There's no direct universal suffrage in America. It just doesn't exist, all right? Of course, for example, Bush won his election. He had fewer votes than Al Gore, right? It happens, it happens, yeah. He had fewer votes than Al Gore. Trump had fewer votes than Hillary Clinton, right? But Trump won the election, okay, because of this system they have, right? And that's actually it's one of the articles in the Constitution. It's Article 4, if you want to look at that briefly, which is on page 16, en haut à droite, là. Donc, on est à la page 16, en haut à droite. So it's here, the United States, Section 4, okay, it's Article 4, Section 4. The United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government. Okay, so the republican form of government includes direct voting, but also includes the system of electors. Okay, that's what the republican form of government is, and shall protect each of them against invasion, etc., and on application of the legislature or of the executive when the legislature cannot be convened, against domestic violence. So the federal government guarantees law and order to the states, and also a republican form of government. Well, we'll look more in detail at these things, yeah, in the weeks to come. Can I ask you a question? Do you know which country it was that in 1905 had a constitutional revolution where they wanted to try and get the best from existing constitutions. They chose the Belgian constitution, the American constitution. They wanted to think about the relation between these constitutional laws and tribal law, traditional custom, coutume law, and religious law. They wanted to try and get the perfect balance of constitutional law in a revolution in 1905, which had a huge influence on constitutional law around the world. Do you know which country that was? Can you guess? France? No. Iran, brava, Iran. You looked it up. Yeah, Iran. Fantastically interesting event. Because tout de suite, il était envahi par les Russes qui ont bombardé le Parlement parce qu'ils ne voulaient pas qu'on développe une démocratie à l'époque. And that had a huge influence, that event. Yeah. So that elasticity of things can also carry contradictions. Okay. And I'd like to look at these three amendments. Donc, vous tournez la page 18. Yeah. So, have you seen a film called Lincoln? No, with Daniel Day-Lewis, about Abraham Lincoln? Yeah, it's quite interesting. I mean, it's a lie to say that the abolition of slavery was Lincoln's idea. That this was not true. It was the idea of two really interesting women who, of course, do not figure in the history, yeah, like most women at the time. It was their idea, not his idea. But it's very interesting, that film Lincoln, because you see how the Congress works. It was very small at the time, yeah? The House of Representatives is very small. It's got much bigger since then. Yeah, it's a very interesting film. There's another film I'd like to recommend to you, which shows the first English people coming to the oldest colony, which is, do you know where the first colony was qui a duré? No? Jamestown, Virginia. Okay? Jamestown, because King James, right? 1607, Jamestown. There's a film, a really interesting film called The New World, made by a guy called Terrence Malick, an American called Malick, qui a fait un grand film de guerre, en français ça s'appelle La Ligne Rouge. Je ne sais pas si vous avez vu ce film, sur la Deuxième Guerre mondiale, c'est génial. Mais il a fait donc ce film qui s'appelle The Nouveau Monde, The New World. And it's about Pocahontas and John Smith. Not Walt Disney Pocahontas. Pocahontas is a really interesting woman. Yeah? Pocahontas went to England, yeah, at Shakespeare's time. And Pocahontas visited the court of King James at the time when there was no racism. There was no racism at the time in England. Okay? Racism is an invention later. Racism is an invention. It's a political invention. Okay? Which was instrumentalisé dans les colonies, racism, yeah, the way of control, right? The way of controlling people with great animosity. But The New World is a very interesting film to understand the character, mentality of the first colonists that I talk about when I talk about the history. Yeah? These were English businessmen coming to North America. Right? I mean, you know, our understanding of the time obviously is very, very weak. In Shakespeare's day, on est dans les années 1580-1620, the sea, la mer, the sea froze in London and in Holland. Et on peut voir des tableaux de gens qui patinent sur la mer. Okay? There was a mini ice age, a mini âge de glace. So you think, okay, et alors, qu'est-ce qu'il raconte? And people thought this was just a curiosity, the mini ice age. It's just one of those blips in the climate that you can explain by mass of the air. And it's only very recently they realized the specific reason for that mini ice age in Europe. The specific reason is the genocide of indigenous peoples in the Americas. That up to that time they killed minimum 10, 15 million indigenous people in the Caribbean, in South America, and in North America. Okay? Quel rapport avec l'âge de glace? So these guys were cultivating land, right? Yeah? They were farmers. And when they were massacred, nature came back, trees. Okay? That cultivated land, they estimate the surface, la superficie de ces terres cultivées, donc ils sont retournés à la nature à cause du génocide, juste ce début de génocide, hein, parce que ça continue évidemment après. Une superficie égale à la France ou à 2 fois la France. Ils ne savent pas exactement. Okay? C'est entre 1 et 2 fois la superficie de la France. So the carbon capture meant that the global temperature fell by about 1 degree or 1.5 degrees globally within a very short time. Okay, and it meant that the sea was freezing in London. Yeah, there was an ice age in Europe, a mini ice age, because of the genocide. It's called genocidal climate change. And it's very interesting for people studying climate change, to see the effects of changes in human activity on the climate. Obviously, I mean, we're right on the plan dedans, oui? Okay. So that kind of history of violence, of genocide, of course, is something that is determinant. It's like slavery. Le discours officiel sur l'esclavage, c'est que l'esclavage est une sorte d'aberration vouée à disparaître. Okay? It's not true. Slavery, the slave economy, is the basis of American capitalism. The richest people in the United States were slave owners. The richest economic zones in the United States were the slave zones. They invented financial instruments, new financial instruments, like hypotheque, for example. They invented them in order to facilitate the slave economy. Right? So slaves were actually transferable. Yeah, they were like a slave became a commodity. Right? They weren't just guys, in a plantation. They could actually be transferred. They could be evaluated abstractly. They invented all kinds of financial instruments to facilitate the slave economy and to develop American capitalism. Okay, it's fundamental that. Okay, because the official line of things often has been traditionally that no, this was just une aberration. Heureusement que ça a disparu parce que la vraie économie américaine c'était pas ça. It's not true. Okay. So I want to look at to go to Article 13 of Article 18. So if you look at the dates of it, it's passed by Congress January 31st, 1865. Vous y êtes là. Donc on est ici, là, en haut à droite de la page 18. Okay? Yeah. Article 13, ça veut dire le 13e amendement. The 13th Amendment. So this is the one that abolishes slavery. The 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. 14th Amendment gives citizenship to blacks, to freed slaves. 15 gives the right to vote, okay, essentially to blacks, okay, not to indigenous Americans, no, but to freed slaves. Okay, that's 13, 14, 15, all right? So, can I read 13? Okay, so 13 says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude. So involuntary servitude, it says here, je saute à la ligne 3, shall exist within the United States. Okay? Donc c'est clair, non? Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. The abolition of slavery. Okay? Let me just go to your lexicon on page 1. On va revenir tout de suite à cet article, ok? Mais sur la page 1, le 8e terme, donc, de votre lexique. Donc, mais donc, à l'avenir, moi je veux dire, bon, regardez le numéro 23, vous allez tout de suite voir, okay? Parce que I don't do a PowerPoint in this class, okay, because there's too much material, all right? Yeah, so I have no PowerPoint here. So look at number 8 in the lexicon, okay? Indentured servitude. You see that? Indentured servitude, yeah? C'est quoi ça? Indentured servitude, in fact, it's white slavery. C'est des gens qui étaient pauvres, dépossédés en Grande-Bretagne par les propriétaires terriens, les grands mouvements d'enclosure, les enclosures, on dit ça, le mouvement des enclosures, oui, ou en Écosse, où on vidait les paysans pour mettre des cerfs ou des moutons. On leur payait le passage en Amérique, en échange, donc c'était gratos. En échange, ils travaillaient 7, 9 ou 11 ans sans salaire. Okay, comme esclaves, en fait, comme servants. Okay? The poor whites, massive class of poor whites. Okay? 35% de mortalité sur les navires pour les pauvres blancs, 40% pour les esclaves. Évidemment, les esclaves étaient dans des conditions beaucoup pires. Non? Les mecs, ils étaient comme des sardines, vous connaissez les images. Non? Mais c'était tellement bas qu'ils ne pouvaient pas se retourner. Donc, c'était plus bas que la largeur de leurs épaules. Okay, so they couldn't actually turn. They were chained and then like sardines. Okay, right? So indentured servants then are these poor white people. Donc, je reviens à cet article, juste pour terminer. Article 13, slavery. Donc, je reprends ma lecture de l'article 13, page 18. Et puis, je termine là-dessus. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted or condemned, shall exist within the United States. So no slavery except as a punishment. Yes, then you can have slavery. So what happened? They abolished slavery. They closed the plantations where the African slave lived. What happens? All these guys have nowhere to live, right? Ils deviennent des SDF, right? So what do they then do? They create a crime of vagabondage. Être vagabond, ça veut dire être SDF, becomes a crime. So then what do? They build hundreds of penitentiaries, prisons. Okay? Hundreds of prisons. And they arrest all these black people for the crime of vagabondage, and they put them in prison. And in prison, they work in chain gangs, yeah? Making the railroads, okay? In the factories, they get free, donc c'est du travail main-d'œuvre gratuit. So that's why they call the American prison system slavery by another name. Slavery by America has 25% of the world's prisoners. 25% des gens en prison dans le monde sont aux États-Unis. And of course, proportionally, a huge number of those guys are black, right? I mean, you know this as well as I do, right? Okay. So slavery is not abolished in the amendments, okay? And slavery was never forbidden in the Constitution. We'll look at that in more detail, okay? It's allowed as a punishment. Okay, and of course it was used as a punishment, all right? So, just to finish then, the first 3 or 4 weeks is going to be historical background, okay? Then it's going to be the legislature, then it's going to be the executive, then it's going to be the judiciary, the tribunal, which is really fascinating. The courts, law, I love law. Okay? I've told you, I've given you some bibliographical elements, but I want you to read this Constitution. Okay? All right? Try to understand the Constitution. Okay? All right. I'll see you next week. Donc si vous avez une question, problème, vous m'envoyez un email, je vous répondrai. Okay?